There is a photograph taken in March of 1912, outside the offices of the Metropolitan Police Service on Whitehall Place. 7 men stand in formation, their faces blurred by the long exposure required in weak London light. Their uniforms are pressed, their hands rest on their belts. Behind them, through a window on the second floor, a single lamp burns. The photograph was taken at 4:47 in the afternoon. By that hour, the case file for Sarah Catherine Linden had already been transferred from active investigation to the closed archives. Her disappearance had been officially resolved. The matter, according to Inspector Thomas Grawley's final notation, required no further inquiry. Sarah Catherine Linden was still missing. She had been missing for 11 days, and she would remain missing for another 43. This is not a story about what was found. This is a story about what was decided before anyone looked. On the evening of March 2, 1912, Sarah Linden was seen leaving the home of her employer, Alderman Geoffrey Pritchard, at 14 Cadogan Square. She wore a gray wool coat with bone buttons. She carried a leather satchel containing, according to later inventory, 3 letters, a tin of biscuits, a handkerchief embroidered with her initials, and a small ledger bound in red cloth. The ledger has never been recovered. The woman who saw her leave was Mrs. Enid Moss, housekeeper to the Pritchard family for 16 years. Mrs. Moss would later describe Sarah's expression as composed but distant. She noticed Sarah pause at the gate, looking back at the house for what Mrs. Moss estimated to be 7 or 8 seconds. Then Sarah turned east toward Sloane Street and walked into the fog that had descended over Chelsea that night. The temperature was 39 degrees. Visibility, according to meteorological records, was less than 20 yards. She was 24 years old. She was never seen alive again. Inspector Thomas Grawley was assigned to the case on March 5, 3 days after Sarah's disappearance was reported by her sister Margaret. He conducted 2 interviews, one with Mrs. Moss, one with Alderman Pritchard. He examined no physical evidence. He requested no search of the Pritchard residence. He filed no supplementary reports. On March 13, 11 days after Sarah vanished, Grawley submitted his findings to Chief Inspector Roland Vess. The report was 4 pages long. Its conclusion was unequivocal. Sarah Catherine Linden had left London of her own volition, likely to escape personal debts or entanglements. No foul play was suspected. The case was to be considered resolved. The file was stamped, dated, and sealed. It was placed in a storage cabinet in the basement of Scotland Yard, where it would remain untouched for 6 years. What is extraordinary is not that the conclusion was wrong. What is extraordinary is the speed with which it was reached, and the totality with which it was believed. Margaret Linden came to the police station on Bow Street 4 times in the 2 weeks following Sarah's disappearance. Each time, she brought new information. A list of Sarah's recent contacts, a timeline of her movements in the days before March 2nd, a description of her state of mind, which Margaret described as troubled but resolute. Margaret also brought a letter Sarah had sent her 3 weeks before she vanished. In it, Sarah wrote, "There are things I have learned that I cannot unknow. I am afraid of what it means to speak, and more afraid of what it means to stay silent." Inspector Grawley did not include this letter in his report. When Margaret asked why, he told her that Sarah's words were the expressions of a melancholic temperament, not evidence of danger. Margaret Linden kept a diary. On March 14th, the day after the case was closed, she wrote, "They have decided she is gone by choice. They have decided she does not matter. I do not know how to make them see her." She would spend the next 43 days trying. Alderman Geoffrey Pritchard was 52 years old in 1912. He sat on the London County Council. He owned 3 properties in Belgravia and a country estate in Sussex. He was a member of the Reform Club and a patron of the arts. He was married. He had no children. Sarah Linden had worked in his household as a private secretary for 14 months. Her duties included correspondence, bookkeeping, and the management of his personal calendar. According to Pritchard's statement to Inspector Grawley, she had been efficient, reliable, and entirely professional. He stated that on the evening of March 2nd, Sarah had completed her work for the day and left at approximately 6:15 p.m. He claimed he had no knowledge of her plans, no insight into her personal life, and no reason to believe she was in distress. When asked if Sarah had seemed unusual in any way, Pritchard replied, "She was always unusual. Intelligent women often are." Inspector Grawley did not ask what he meant by this. He did not ask what Sarah had been working on in the days before she disappeared. He did not ask why a woman described as reliable would abandon her post without notice. He wrote down Pritchard's answers, thanked him for his time, and left. In the inventory of Sarah's belongings, compiled by her sister Margaret, there is mention of a red cloth-bound ledger, approximately 6 inches by 9 inches, with gilt edges and a leather tie. Margaret stated that Sarah carried this ledger with her always. She used it, Margaret believed, to record financial accounts related to her work for Alderman Pritchard. Mrs. Moss, the housekeeper, confirmed she had seen Sarah place this ledger in her satchel on the evening of March 2nd. She remembered it specifically because Sarah held it for a moment before tucking it away, as though weighing whether to take it at all. The ledger was never found. Not in Sarah's rooms on Gloucester Street. Not in the Pritchard household. Not in any of the locations Sarah was known to frequent. When Margaret mentioned the ledger to Inspector Grawley, he noted it in his report as a personal journal, likely destroyed or discarded. He did not investigate its contents. He did not ask why a bookkeeper's ledger might be considered personal. But Margaret remembered something Sarah had told her 6 weeks before she vanished. Sarah had said, "If something happens to me, find the red book. Don't let them tell you it doesn't matter." London in March of 1912 was a city wrapped in its own exhalations. Smoke from 10,000 coal fires mixed with river mist to create fog so thick that cab drivers tied lanterns to their horses' heads and walked beside them, counting steps to measure distance. In this kind of fog, a woman could vanish within seconds of leaving a doorway. She could turn a corner and dissolve into gray. She could walk 10 feet from witnesses and become unreachable. This is what Inspector Grawley's report implied, that Sarah Linden had walked into the fog and simply kept walking. That she had used the weather as an accomplice to her own disappearance. That the city had swallowed her willingly, and she had let it. But fog does not erase a person. It only obscures them. And in 1912, the machinery of forgetting was far more efficient than the weather. The case was closed, the file was buried, and for 43 days, no one looked for Sarah Catherine Linden. No one, that is, except her sister. Margaret Linden was 27 years old, unmarried, and employed as a seamstress in a shop on Kensington High Street. She had no connections to the police, no influence with officials, no resources beyond her wages and her will. What she had was a map. In the weeks following Sarah's disappearance, Margaret began to retrace her sister's movements. She visited every location Sarah had mentioned in letters, every shop she frequented, every street corner where she might have paused. She asked questions, she took notes. She drew a grid of Sarah's life and began to search each square. On March 21st, 19 days after Sarah vanished, Margaret found a door she had not expected. It was on a narrow lane called Elder Yard, off the Strand, barely wide enough for a single cart. The door was painted black. It had no sign, no number, no indication of what lay behind it. But Margaret had found a receipt in Sarah's room, dated February 28th, 4 days before she disappeared. The receipt was from a printer. The address listed was Elder Yard. Margaret knocked on the door. No one answered. She came back the next day, and the next, and the next. On the 4th day, the door opened. The man who answered the door was named Simon Wick. He was 63 years old, a compositor by trade, with ink-stained hands and a stoop from decades bent over typeset trays. His shop was a single room, cluttered with presses and paper and the sharp smell of lead. Margaret showed him the receipt. She showed him a photograph of Sarah. She asked if he remembered her. Wick studied the photograph for a long time. Then he said, "She came here to have something copied, a list, 20 pages handwritten. She paid me double to do it in one night." Margaret asked what the list contained. Wick shook his head. "I didn't read it, not my business, but I remember she said she needed 3 copies, one for herself, one for safekeeping, and one," he paused, "one for someone who wouldn't want to see it." Margaret asked what he meant. Wick said Sarah had smiled when she said it, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of someone preparing for a fight. Margaret asked if Wick still had the original. He said no. Sarah had taken all 3 copies with her when she left. He never saw her again. But he remembered one other thing. As Sarah was leaving, she'd turned back and said, "If anyone asks about this, tell them you've never seen me." 2 days later, Sarah disappeared. Why would a woman working as a private secretary need 3 copies of a list? Why would she pay double to have it printed overnight? Why would she warn a printer to deny knowing her? These questions should have been asked by the police. They were not. Inspector Grawley's report contains no mention of Sarah's visit to Elder Yard, no acknowledgement that she had taken steps to preserve information she considered dangerous. Margaret brought this information to Bow Street Station on March 23rd. She was told that Inspector Grawley was unavailable. She returned on March 24th. She was told the case was closed and could not be reopened without new evidence. Margaret asked, "Is this not new evidence?" The desk sergeant, a man named Pell, looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Miss Linden, sometimes a closed case is closed for a reason." Margaret asked what reason. Sergeant Pell did not answer. But he looked at the paper she had brought, the receipt from the printer, and then he looked at her, and Margaret saw something in his face that she would later describe in her diary as not quite pity, something closer to warning. She left the station. She did not go back. On the night of March 26th, 24 days after Sarah's disappearance, Margaret Linden was woken by a sound outside her door. It was past midnight. The boarding house where she lived was silent except for the creak of old wood settling in the cold. Someone knocked 3 times. Soft, deliberate, spaced evenly. Margaret did not open the door. She asked who was there. No answer. She asked again. Still nothing. Then a voice muffled through the wood. "Stop asking questions." Margaret stood frozen. She did not recognize the voice. It was male, low, carefully neutral. Not threatening in tone, but absolute in intent. The voice said, "Your sister made a mistake. Don't make the same one." Then footsteps, slow, measured, moving away down the hall. By the time Margaret unlocked her door and looked out, the hallway was empty. She did not sleep that night. She sat by the window, watching the street, waiting for a figure that never appeared. In her diary, she wrote, "They know I am looking. They want me to stop. That means I am close." The next morning, she changed her approach. She stopped going to the police. She stopped asking questions in public. She began to search in silence. Margaret found the second list hidden in the spine of a book. It was a volume of Tennyson, In Memoriam, that had belonged to Sarah. Margaret had looked through it a dozen times before, but on March 28th, she felt the binding crack open in an unusual way. Inside, pressed flat between the backing and the leather, was a folded sheet of paper. It was in Sarah's handwriting. It was a list of names, 14 names, all men. Beside each name, a series of numbers. Beside the numbers, initials. At the bottom of the page, in Sarah's hand, confirmed. GP aware, copies made 28 February. Margaret recognized one name immediately. Alderman Jeffrey Pritchard, Sarah's employer. But the other names meant nothing to her. She copied them carefully into her own notebook. She began to research. What she found over the following days was a pattern. 10 of the 14 men held public office, aldermen, councillors, magistrates. 3 were prominent businessmen. 1 was a barrister, and every single one of them had connections, either professional or social, to Alderman Jeffrey Pritchard. Margaret did not yet understand what the numbers meant. She did not know what Sarah had confirmed, or what GP aware signified. But she understood one thing with absolute clarity. Sarah had been tracking something, and that something involved powerful men. On April 3rd, 32 days after Sarah's disappearance, Margaret returned to 14 Cadogan Square. She did not go to the front door. She waited across the street, in the shelter of a plane tree, and watched the house for 3 hours. At 10:47 a.m., Mrs. Moss, the housekeeper, left through the servants' entrance carrying a basket. Margaret crossed the street and knocked. A young maid answered. Margaret said she had come to retrieve an item her sister had left behind, a small sewing kit. The maid, uncertain, let her in. Margaret climbed to the second floor, where Sarah had kept a small office. The door was locked. Margaret had anticipated this. She had brought a hat pin and a tension wrench fashioned from a corset stay. She had practiced on her own door for 2 nights. The lock gave way in 40 seconds. Inside, the room was immaculate. The desk was empty. The shelves were bare. There was no trace that Sarah had ever worked there. Except for one thing. In the corner, beneath a loose floorboard, Margaret discovered by the faint creak underfoot, was a bundle of papers tied with string. They were pages torn from a ledger. The edges were singed, as though someone had tried to burn them and then stopped. The pages were covered in columns of figures. At the top of each page, a name. At the bottom, a notation, paid. No record. Margaret took the pages. She left the room exactly as she had found it. She walked out of the house without being seen. That night, she began to understand what her sister had uncovered. The pages Margaret found were fragments of a larger system. Each one detailed payments made from the office of Alderman Pritchard to various individuals and firms. The amounts ranged from £20 to £500. The dates spanned 18 months. But there was a problem. When Margaret cross-referenced these payments with public records of council expenditures, she found no corresponding entries. The money had been paid, but it had not been recorded. It had been moved through Pritchard's accounts and then erased from official documentation. This is what Sarah had been tracking. Not embezzlement in the ordinary sense, but something more systemic, a network of payments disguised as legitimate expenses that were being funneled to men whose names appeared on Sarah's list. Margaret did not know what the payments were for. She did not know if they were bribes, kickbacks, or something else entirely. But she knew one thing. Sarah had documented it. She had made copies, and someone had wanted those copies destroyed badly enough to make Sarah disappear. Margaret sat in her small room on Gloucester Street, the singed pages spread across her table, and felt the weight of what her sister had uncovered. She felt, too, the weight of what it meant to know. Because knowing meant choosing, and choosing meant risk. On April 7th, 36 days after Sarah's disappearance, Margaret made a decision. She would not go to the police. She would not go to the newspapers. She would not trust institutions that had already failed her sister. She would go to the one person who might have answers, and more importantly, might be afraid enough to give them. She would go to Alderman Geoffrey Pritchard. But she would not go as a supplicant. She would not go to beg for information or plead for help. She would go with the pages she had found. She would go with the list of names. She would go with the knowledge that Sarah had carried with her into the fog. She would go as a threat. Margaret spent the evening of April 7th preparing. She copied the pages again, hiding the originals in 3 separate locations. She wrote a letter detailing everything she had learned, addressed to her cousin in Bristol, with instructions to deliver it to a solicitor if she did not return within 2 days. Then she put on her grey coat, the one that matched Sarah's, and walked through the gaslit streets of Chelsea toward Cadogan Square. The night was clear. The fog had lifted. For the first time in weeks, she could see the stars. She did not know if she would survive what came next, but she knew she could not turn back. Margaret arrived at 14 Cadogan Square at 8:30 in the evening. She did not knock at the front door. She went around to the side entrance, where deliveries were made, and knocked there instead. Mrs. Moss answered. She looked at Margaret with an expression that was difficult to read. Recognition? Certainly, but also something like resignation. She said, "Miss Linden, you shouldn't be here." Margaret said, "I need to speak with Alderman Pritchard." Mrs. Moss shook her head. "He won't see you." Margaret held up the envelope containing the singed pages. "Tell him I have what Sarah had. Tell him I know what she knew. Tell him I'll be at the Lion's Corner house on the Strand tomorrow at noon. If he doesn't come, I'll take this to the Chronicle." Mrs. Moss stared at the envelope. Her face went pale. She said quietly, "You don't know what you're doing." Margaret said, "I know exactly what I'm doing." She turned and walked away, her heart pounding, her hands steady. She did not look back. She could feel Mrs. Moss watching her, until she turned the corner and disappeared into the night. The trap was set. Now all she could do was wait. Margaret did not sleep that night. She sat in her room, fully dressed, with the lights off and the curtains open. She watched the street below, looking for movement, for the shape of a man standing in shadow, for any sign that her visit to Cadogan Square had triggered a response. At 3:30 in the morning, she saw him, a figure in a dark coat, standing beneath a street lamp across from her building. He was not trying to hide. He simply stood there, motionless, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. Margaret watched him for 20 minutes. He did not move. He did not look up at her window. He simply stood, like a monument, like a warning. At 4:10, another figure approached him. They spoke briefly. Then the second man handed the first an envelope. The first man opened it, read whatever was inside, and then both men walked away in opposite directions. Margaret sat back from the window. Her hands were shaking. She understood now that this was not a matter of uncovering the truth. This was a matter of survival. But she also understood something else. She had leverage. They would not have sent a watcher if they were not afraid. She would go to the Lion's Corner house at noon, and she would see if Alderman Pritchard was afraid enough to come. At noon on April 8th, Margaret sat at a table by the window of the Lion's Corner house on the Strand. She ordered tea. She did not drink it. She watched the door. Alderman Pritchard did not come. Not at noon. Not at 12:30. Not at 1 o'clock. But someone else did. At 12:15, a man in a gray suit entered the cafe. He was in his 40s, clean-shaven, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. He scanned the room, saw Margaret, and walked directly to her table. He did not ask permission to sit. He simply pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He said, "Miss Linden, my name is Edmund Calder. I'm a solicitor representing Alderman Pritchard. He asked me to meet with you in his stead." Margaret said, "I asked to see him, not his lawyer." Calder smiled. It was not a warm smile. "The alderman is a busy man, but he has authorized me to discuss your concerns and to assure you that there has been a misunderstanding." Margaret placed the envelope on the table. "This is not a misunderstanding. This is evidence." Calder did not touch the envelope. He did not even look at it. He said, "Miss Linden, your sister left her employment voluntarily. The alderman has no knowledge of her current whereabouts. Any documents you believe you have found are likely misinterpretations of routine financial records." Margaret leaned forward. "Then why did someone come to my door and tell me to stop asking questions?" Calder's expression did not change, but something in his eyes shifted. He said quietly, "I don't know what you're referring to." Margaret said, "Yes, you do." Edmund Calder sat back in his chair. He looked at Margaret for a long time, as though assessing something he had not expected to find. Then, he said, "Miss Linden, I'm going to speak plainly. You are pursuing a matter that will not end well for you. Your sister made certain allegations. Those allegations were investigated and found to be without merit. The case is closed." Margaret said, "The case was closed before Sarah's body was found, because it still hasn't been found." Calder's jaw tightened. "Precisely. Because there is no body, because there is no crime. Your sister left London. That is the conclusion of the Metropolitan Police, and it is the conclusion you should accept." Margaret said, "And if I don't?" Calder reached into his jacket and withdrew an envelope. He placed it on the table beside the envelope Margaret had brought. He said, "This contains £200. It is being offered to you as compensation for any distress you have experienced. In exchange, you will cease all inquiries into your sister's disappearance. You will return any documents you have taken, and you will sign an agreement stating that you will make no further contact with Alderman Pritchard or any of his associates." Margaret looked at the envelope. £200, more than she would earn in a year. She looked back at Calder. "You're paying me to forget my sister." Calder said, "I'm paying you to move on with your life." Margaret picked up the envelope containing the signed pages. She stood. She said, "Tell Alderman Pritchard that my sister's life was worth more than £200, and so is the truth." She walked out of the cafe. Behind her, Edmund Calder sat alone at the table, watching her go. Margaret knew she could not go to the police. She knew she could not trust solicitors or officials. But there was one other avenue, one other possibility: the press. On the evening of April 8th, Margaret went to the offices of the Chronicle on Fleet Street. She asked to speak with someone in the news department. She was directed to a small, cluttered room on the third floor, where a man named Arthur Henley sat behind a desk piled with papers, smoking a cigarette and reading through a stack of correspondence. Henley was 36 years old, a senior reporter who had built a reputation covering corruption in municipal government. He looked up as Margaret entered, gestured to a chair, and said, "You've got 5 minutes." Margaret told him everything. Sarah's disappearance, the closed investigation, the ledger, the list of names, the payments, the singed pages, the offer from Calder. Henley listened without interrupting. When she finished, he stubbed out his cigarette and said, "Do you have proof?" Margaret placed the singed pages on his desk. Henley picked them up, studied them, and then looked at Margaret. He said, "Do you understand what this is?" Margaret said, "I think it's evidence of corruption." Henley said, "It's more than that. If these payments are what you think they are, if they're bribes or kickbacks involving public officials, then this is a story that could bring down a dozen men, maybe more." Margaret felt a surge of hope. "So you'll print it?" Henley shook his head. "I can't. Not yet. Not without corroboration. Not without your sister." Margaret's hope collapsed. "She's missing. That's the whole point." Henley leaned forward. "I know, but without her testimony, all I have is a list of numbers and a missing woman. That's not enough. I need a body, or I need a witness, or I need someone inside that system willing to talk." Margaret said, "So you're telling me there's nothing you can do?" Henley said, "I'm telling you I need more time." For 3 days, Margaret heard nothing from Arthur Henley. She continued to work at the shop on Kensington High Street, sewing hems and taking orders, her hands moving through familiar motions while her mind churned through possibilities and fears. On April 11th, 40 days after Sarah's disappearance, Henley sent word. He had found someone willing to talk. A clerk in the London County Council offices who had worked under Alderman Pritchard. The clerk had noticed irregularities in financial reports and had kept copies of documents he thought might one day be needed. Henley wanted Margaret to meet with the clerk, to verify that what she had found matched what the clerk had seen, to build a case strong enough to print. Margaret agreed. They arranged to meet on the evening of April 12th at a pub called The Bell on Aldersgate Street. The clerk's name was William Finch. He was 28 years old and he was terrified. Margaret arrived at the Bell at 7 o'clock. Henley was already there sitting in a corner booth. Across from him sat a thin, pale man with wire-rimmed spectacles and hands that would not stop moving. Henley introduced him. "Miss Linden, this is William Finch." Finch looked at Margaret and said, "I shouldn't be here. If they find out I've spoken to you." Margaret said, "They've already threatened me. If we're both at risk, we might as well tell the truth." Finch nodded, though he did not look convinced. He reached into a satchel and pulled out a folder. Inside were ledger pages, similar to the ones Margaret had found, but more extensive. Months of payments, dozens of transactions. Finch said, "I copied these 6 months ago. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know what to do with them. Then I heard your sister had gone missing, and I thought..." He stopped. "I thought maybe she'd found the same thing I did," Margaret said. "She did." William Finch spread the ledger pages across the table. He and Margaret and Arthur Henley bent over them, tracing the flow of money from one account to another, from public funds into private pockets, from legitimate expenditures into hidden channels. What they found was a system. Not a single act of corruption, but an entire infrastructure built to siphon money from the city's coffers. It worked like this. Contracts for public works, road repairs, building maintenance, sanitation services were awarded to specific firms. Those firms would bill the city for services rendered. The city would pay. But the firms were shells. They existed on paper, but they did not do the work. The work was either never done at all, or it was done by other contractors who were paid a fraction of the original bid. The difference, sometimes hundreds of pounds per contract, was divided among the men who had arranged the scheme. Alderman Geoffrey Pritchard was at the center. But he was not alone. The list of names Sarah had compiled, the 14 men, were all part of it. They approved contracts, signed off on payments, and ensured that no one asked too many questions. And Sarah Catherine Linden, in her role as Pritchard's private secretary, had seen it all. She had kept the books, she had tracked the payments, and at some point she had decided to document it. Finch said, "She must have realized what she was looking at. She must have known she had to act." Margaret said, "She did act. She made copies. She was going to expose them." Henley said, "And they stopped her." Arthur Henley took the ledger pages back to the Chronicle offices that night. He spent the next 2 days verifying the information, cross-referencing the payments with public records, contacting sources within the council who could confirm that the firms listed were indeed fraudulent. On April 14th, 42 days after Sarah's disappearance, Henley met with his editor, a man named Thornton. Henley presented the case. He explained the scheme, the players, the evidence. He asked for permission to print. Thornton listened. Then he said, "Do we have the woman?" Henley said, "She's missing, presumed dead." Thornton said, "Then we have a problem. We're accusing sitting officials of organized fraud. If we print this without an eyewitness, they'll bury us in libel suits. We need the woman. We need her testimony." Henley said, "She's gone, but we have her documents. We have Finch's corroboration." Thornton shook his head. "It's not enough. Find the woman or find someone else who will go on record. Until then, we sit on this." Henley left the office furious and helpless. He met Margaret at a cafe near Charing Cross and told her the news. Margaret said, "So they win. Even when we have proof, they win." Henley said, "Not if we find your sister." Margaret said, "She's been gone for 42 days. If she's alive, she's in hiding. If she's dead..." Her voice broke. "If she's dead, we need to find her body." Henley said, "Then that's what we do." On April 15th, Margaret and Arthur Henley began a systematic search for Sarah Catherine Linden. They started with the places Sarah was known to have visited in the days before she disappeared. They spoke to shopkeepers, cab drivers, waitresses, anyone who might have seen her. Most remembered nothing. A few remembered a woman in a gray coat, but their descriptions were vague, their memories unreliable. Henley had a theory. If Sarah had been planning to expose the scheme, she would have needed a safe place to store her evidence. Not in her rooms, where it could be found. Not with Margaret, who could be threatened. Somewhere secure. Somewhere no one would think to look. He asked Margaret, "Did Sarah have friends? Acquaintances outside of London? Anyone she trusted completely?" Margaret thought for a long time. Then she said, "There was a woman, Elizabeth Granger. She and Sarah went to school together. She lives in Hampstead. Sarah visited her sometimes." Henley said, "We start there." They took the train to Hampstead the next morning. Elizabeth Granger lived in a small cottage on Flask Walk, surrounded by gardens. When Margaret knocked, Elizabeth answered immediately, as though she had been waiting. She looked at Margaret and said, "You're Sarah's sister." Margaret said, "Yes. I need to know if Sarah came to see you, in February or early March." Elizabeth hesitated. Then she stepped aside and said, "You'd better come in." Elizabeth Granger led Margaret and Arthur Henley into her sitting room. She closed the door behind them and said, "Sarah came to see me on March 1st, the day before she disappeared." Margaret's breath caught. "What did she say?" Elizabeth went to a writing desk in the corner of the room. She opened a drawer and pulled out a small wooden box about the size of a cigar case. She handed it to Margaret. Elizabeth said, "She gave this to me. She told me to keep it safe. She said if anything happened to her, I was to give it to you, no one else." Margaret opened the box. Inside was a key. A small brass key with a number stamped on the head, 217. Margaret said, "What does this open?" Elizabeth said, "She didn't tell me. She just said you would know what to do with it." Henley leaned forward. "Did she say anything else? Anything about where she was going? What she was planning?" Elizabeth nodded slowly. "She said she was going to meet someone who could help her. She wouldn't tell me who, but she was frightened. I asked her to stay the night, to wait, but she said she couldn't. She said she'd waited too long already." Margaret turned the key over in her hand. The number 217 was etched cleanly into the brass. It meant nothing to her. She looked at Henley. He said, "It's a deposit box, bank or safety deposit company. We need to find out which one." Elizabeth said, "There's something else." She reached back into the drawer and withdrew an envelope. "She left this too. She said not to open it unless..." Elizabeth's voice wavered. "Unless she didn't come back." Margaret took the envelope. Her name was written on the front in Sarah's careful hand. She broke the seal and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The letter was dated March 1st, 1912. It read, "My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, then I have failed. I have tried to do what is right, but I fear I have underestimated the lengths to which powerful men will go to protect their secrets. The key will lead you to evidence. Everything I found, everything I documented, is there. Use it wisely. Trust no one in authority. They are either complicit or compromised. I am meeting with someone tonight who claims he can help me bring this to light. His name is Detective Sergeant James Croft. He works out of Gerald Road Station. He says he has been investigating Pritchard independently and wants to coordinate our efforts. I want to believe him. I need to believe him. But Margaret, if something happens to me, you must consider that I was wrong to trust him. Find the truth. Make them see what I saw. Do not let them bury me the way they bury everything else. Your loving sister, Sarah." Margaret read the letter twice. Then she looked at Henley. She said she was going to meet a police detective the night before she disappeared. Henley said, "Detective Sergeant James Croft, Gerald Road Station." Margaret said, "We need to find him." Gerald Road Station was a brick building near Sloane Square, 2 stories with barred windows and the perpetual smell of damp wool and coal smoke. Margaret and Arthur Henley arrived at 2:30 on the afternoon of April 16th. They asked for Detective Sergeant James Croft. The desk sergeant, a heavy-set man with a thick mustache, looked at them with an expression somewhere between confusion and suspicion. He said, "There's no Detective Sergeant Croft at this station." Margaret said, "Are you certain? James Croft, he would have been here in March." The sergeant shook his head. "We've got 3 detective sergeants, none of them named Croft, never had anyone by that name far as I know." Henley said, "Could he have been transferred? Reassigned?" The sergeant said, "I've been here 9 years. I know every man who's come through, no James Croft." Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her. She said, "That's impossible. My sister had a letter. She was meeting with him." The sergeant's expression softened slightly. "Your sister?" Margaret said. "Sarah Catherine Linden. She disappeared on March 2nd. The sergeant's face changed. Recognition or something like it. He said, "The Linden case? That was Grawley's investigation. Closed weeks ago." Margaret said, "I know it was closed. That's why I'm here. My sister said she was meeting with a Detective Sergeant Croft the night she disappeared. If he doesn't exist, then—" She didn't finish. She didn't need to. The implication hung in the air between them. Henley said, "Do you keep records? Personnel files? Could you check?" The sergeant hesitated. Then he said, "Wait here." He disappeared into a back office. Margaret stood in the waiting area, her hands shaking. If there was no James Croft, then Sarah had been lied to. She had been lured out under false pretenses. She had walked into a trap. The sergeant returned 10 minutes later. He held a ledger. He said, "I checked. Personnel records going back 15 years. No James Croft. Not here, not at any other station in the division." Margaret said quietly, "So whoever she met with, he wasn't a police officer." The sergeant said, "Or he was, and he gave her a false name." Margaret and Henley left Gerald Road Station in silence. They walked through the streets of Chelsea as the afternoon light faded into dusk. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, Margaret said, "She trusted him. She thought he was helping her." Henley said, "Which means whoever he was convincing. He knew enough about the investigation to make it believable." Margaret stopped walking. She turned to face Henley. "What if it was someone from the police? What if this goes higher than Pritchard?" Henley said, "Then we're dealing with something far more dangerous than municipal corruption." Margaret thought of the watcher outside her building, the voice at her door, the speed with which the case had been closed, the refusal to investigate, the offer of money. She said, "They're protecting themselves. All of them. The officials, the police, maybe others. They're all part of it." Henley said, "Or they're being pressured by people who are." Margaret said, "Either way, Sarah walked into that meeting thinking she would be protected. And instead, she couldn't finish. The weight of it was too much. Her sister, trusting and desperate and brave, walking towards someone who had promised help and delivered something else entirely." Henley said, "We still have the key. Whatever Sarah hid, it's still there. That's our priority now." Margaret nodded. She reached into her pocket and felt the small brass key. the number 217. Somewhere in London, there was a box with that number, and inside that box was everything Sarah had died to preserve. They just had to find it. In 1912, more than 30 banks and safety deposit companies operating in central London. Some catered to the wealthy, with marble halls and velvet-lined vaults. Others served clerks and tradesmen, offering small boxes in cramped basements for a few shillings a year. Margaret and Henley began with the most likely candidates. Establishments near Sarah's rooms on Gloucester Street or near the Pritchard residence on Cadogan Square. They visited 8 institutions on April 17th alone. Each time, they showed the key. Each time, they were told the same thing. The key did not match their system, or they had no record of a Sarah Catherine Linden, or they could not provide information without proper documentation. By the end of the day, Margaret was exhausted and discouraged. Henley suggested they split up, cover more ground. Margaret agreed. On April 18th, 46 days after Sarah's disappearance, Margaret visited 4 more locations. Nothing. Henley visited 6. Nothing. On April 19th, Margaret went to a small deposit company on Theobald's Road near Gray's Inn. The building was narrow, wedged between a solicitor's office and a tobacconist's. The sign above the door read, City Secure Storage, Est, 1887. Margaret entered. The interior was dim, lit by gas lamps. Behind a wooden counter stood an elderly man with wire spectacles and ink-stained fingers. Margaret showed him the key. She said, "I'm trying to locate a deposit box, number 217. The man took the key, examined it closely, and then looked up at her. He said, "You're the second person to ask about this box." Margaret's heart began to race. "What do you mean?" the man said. "A gentleman came in 3 weeks ago. Asked if we had a box with this number. I told him we did." Margaret said, "Did you let him access it?" The man shook his head. "Couldn't. He didn't have the key. And our records show the box was rented by a Miss Sarah Linden. I told him only she could access it, or someone with written authorization." Margaret said, "What did he look like?" The man said, "Tall, well-dressed, spoke like a gentleman, had a scar here." He traced a line across his left cheek. "He wasn't pleased when I wouldn't let him in. But rules are rules." Margaret felt a surge of hope and terror at once. Sarah's deposit box was here, but someone else was looking for it. She said, "I'm Sarah's sister. She's missing. I have the key and I need to access the box." The man studied her for a long moment. Then he said, "You'll need proof of identity and a death certificate or a legal document granting you access." Margaret said, "She's not dead. She's missing." The man said, "Then you'll need a solicitor or a court order." "I'm sorry, miss, but I can't let you in without proper authorization." Margaret left City Secure Storage and went directly to Arthur Henley's office at the Chronicle. She told him what she'd learned. Henley listened, then said, "We need a solicitor, someone who can file the paperwork to get you access." Margaret said, "That could take weeks. Whoever that man was, he's already tried once, he'll try again." Henley said, "Then we make sure we get there first." He made a telephone call. 20 minutes later, they were sitting in the office of a solicitor named Martin Ashwell, a man Henley had worked with on previous investigations. Ashwell was in his 50s, balding, with a precise manner and a reputation for discretion. Henley explained the situation. Ashwell listened, took notes, and then said, "This is irregular. Miss Linden is missing, not deceased. Her assets are technically still hers. You'd need to petition the court to be named her legal representative, which requires evidence that she's unable to manage her own affairs." Margaret said, "She's been missing for 46 days. Isn't that evidence enough?" Ashwell said, "It should be, but the court will want proof that she hasn't simply left of her own accord. And given that the police investigation concluded exactly that." Margaret interrupted. "The police investigation was a lie. The case was closed to protect the men my sister was trying to expose." Ashwell looked at her carefully. "That's a serious accusation." Margaret said, "I have proof." She pulled out the ledger pages, the list of names, the letter from Sarah. She spread them across Ashwell's desk. She said, "My sister documented a corruption scheme involving Alderman Pritchard and a dozen other officials. She was meeting with someone she thought was a police detective the night she disappeared. That person doesn't exist. And now her safety deposit box, the one that contains the full evidence, is being sought by someone who tried to access it 3 weeks ago. Ashwell read through the documents. His expression grew more grave with each page. Finally, he looked up and said, "If what you're saying is true, then your sister was murdered to protect this scheme. And whoever killed her is still looking for the evidence she left behind." Margaret said, "Yes." Ashwell was silent for a moment. Then he said, "I'll file the petition tonight. I'll argue exigent circumstances. But Miss Linden, you need to understand, if these people are willing to kill your sister, they're willing to kill you." Margaret said, "I know." Ashwell said, "Then we move quickly." That night, Margaret did not go home. Henley arranged for her to stay in a spare room above the Chronicle offices, a cramped space filled with old typeset trays and stacks of newsprint. She lay awake, listening to the sounds of the city beyond the window, and thought about her sister. She thought about Sarah walking into the fog on March 2nd. About Sarah trusting the man who called himself Detective Sergeant James Croft. About Sarah, in those final moments, realizing she had been deceived. Margaret wondered if her sister had been afraid, if she had fought, if she had called out for help. She wondered where Sarah was now. If her body was buried in some forgotten place, or sunk in the Thames, or hidden in a cellar where no one would ever think to look. She wondered if she would ever know. At 3 a.m, Henley knocked softly on the door. Margaret sat up. Henley said, "I couldn't sleep either. I've been thinking about something." Margaret said, "What?" Henley said, "The man who tried to access the deposit box. The man with the scar. If he's part of this, if he's working for Pritchard or one of the others, then he knows you're looking for the same thing he is. He might be watching the deposit company, waiting for you to show up." Margaret said, "So when I go to access the box," Henley said, "you'll be walking into a trap, just like your sister did." Margaret was silent. Then she said, "What choice do I have? If I don't get that evidence, they win. Sarah died for nothing." Henley said, "I know, but we're not letting you go in alone. I'll be there. And I'm bringing people I trust. If anyone tries to stop you, we'll be ready." Margaret said, "You're risking your life for this." Henley said, "So are you. Might as well do it together." On April 21st, 49 days after Sarah's disappearance, Martin Ashwell appeared before a magistrate with an emergency petition. He argued that Sarah Catherine Linden had been missing for 7 weeks under suspicious circumstances, that her sister Margaret had evidence suggesting foul play, and that time was of the essence in accessing Sarah's safety deposit box. The magistrate, a man named Justice Harrow, reviewed the documents. He asked pointed questions. He expressed skepticism about the police investigation. He noted that it was highly unusual to grant access to someone's property without a declaration of death or incompetence. But he also noted that the circumstances were unusual. And after 30 minutes of deliberation, he signed the order. Ashwell left the courthouse and went directly to the Chronicle offices, where Margaret and Henley were waiting. He handed Margaret the document. He said, "This gives you legal access to the deposit box. But Miss Linden," Justice Harrow made something very clear. "If you're wrong, if your sister simply left and there's no evidence of foul play, you could face charges for making false statements and wasting the court's time." Margaret said, "I'm not wrong." Ashwell said, "Then go and be careful." Margaret, Henley, and Ashwell took a cab to Theobald's Road. It was 2:30 in the afternoon. The streets were busy with foot traffic. The city's secure storage building looked exactly as it had 2 days before. Narrow, unremarkable, easy to overlook. Henley had brought 2 men with him. Junior reporters from the Chronicle, both young and capable. They positioned themselves across the street, watching the entrance. Margaret took a breath. Then she walked inside. The elderly clerk was behind the counter again. He looked up as Margaret entered, and recognition flickered across his face. She placed the court order and the key on the counter. She said, "I have legal authorization to access box 217. The clerk read the document carefully. Then he nodded. He said, "Follow me." He led her through a door behind the counter, down a narrow staircase into the basement. The air grew cooler, damp. The walls were lined with metal boxes, each with a number stamped into the front. The clerk stopped at box 217. It was halfway up the wall, small, perhaps 10 inches wide by 6 inches high. He inserted a master key into one lock. Margaret inserted Sarah's key into the other. They turned simultaneously. The door swung open. Inside was a leather folio, tied shut with string. Margaret lifted it out. It was heavier than she expected. She could feel the weight of paper inside, the density of documentation. The clerk said, "You can examine it upstairs if you'd like privacy." Margaret nodded. She carried the folio back up the stairs into the main room. The clerk gestured to a small desk in the corner. Margaret sat down. Her hands were shaking. She untied the string. She opened the folio. Inside were 3 ledgers. Each one was filled with Sarah's handwriting, dates, names, amounts, notations. There were also letters, copies of correspondence between Pritchard and the other men on the list. There were receipts. There were contracts. There were annotated diagrams showing the flow of money through shell companies. It was everything. A complete, meticulous record of the entire scheme. Months of work, documented with the precision of someone who understood that lives might depend on it. At the bottom of the folio was a sealed envelope. On the front, in Sarah's hand. For Margaret. "If you are reading this, I am dead." Margaret's vision blurred. She blinked, forced herself to breathe. She opened the envelope. The letter inside was dated February 28, 1912. 2 days before Sarah disappeared. It read, "My dearest Margaret, if you have found this, then my worst fears have come true. I am writing this in the early hours of the morning, unable to sleep, knowing that tomorrow I will set events in motion that cannot be undone. I have discovered something terrible. The men I work for, the men who present themselves as servants of the public, are thieves. They have stolen thousands of pounds from the city. They have enriched themselves while people suffer, and they have done it with such confidence, such arrogance, that they believe they will never be caught. I cannot let this stand. I have spent the last 4 months documenting their crimes. Everything is here. The payments, the false contracts, the shell companies, the names of everyone involved. It is enough to bring them all down. But I am afraid. I have made copies of this evidence. I have tried to find someone I can trust to help me. A journalist, a police officer, someone who can act on this without being compromised. I thought I had found him. Detective Sergeant James Croft contacted me 3 weeks ago. He said he had been investigating Pritchard independently. He said if I brought him my evidence, he could protect me and ensure that charges were filed. I want to believe him. But there is a voice in my head that whispers, what if he is one of them? What if this is a trap? I have decided to meet with him tomorrow night. If he is genuine, then perhaps this will finally be over. If he is not, Margaret, if something happens to me, do not grieve for long. Take this evidence and finish what I started. Go to the newspapers. Go to the courts. Make them see what I saw. Do not trust the police. Do not trust officials. They are either part of this or they are too afraid to act. Trust yourself. Trust the truth. I love you. I am so sorry for what I have brought upon us both. Your sister, Sarah Margaret, sat in the small office of City Secure Storage, holding her sister's final words, and allowed herself to weep. Not for long. She did not have time for long. But for a moment, she let the grief come. Then she wiped her eyes. She tied the folio shut. She stood. She had what she needed. Now she had to make sure it reached the world. Margaret walked out of City Secure Storage at 3:15. Arthur Henley and his 2 reporters were waiting across the street. Margaret held up the folio. Henley nodded. They began walking toward Fleet Street. The plan was to go directly to the Chronicle offices, to lock the evidence in the paper's safe, and to begin preparing the story for publication. They made it 2 blocks. A man stepped out of a doorway ahead of them. He was tall, well-dressed, with a scar running down his left cheek. He did not speak. He simply stood in their path. Henley stopped. He said, "We're going to need you to move." The man said, "Give me the folio." Margaret stepped back. Henley positioned himself between her and the man. He said, "That's not going to happen." The man reached into his coat. For a moment, Margaret thought he was drawing a weapon, but instead, he pulled out a wallet. He opened it. Inside was a police badge. The man said, "Detective Inspector Roland Vess, Metropolitan Police. That folio contains evidence relevant to an ongoing investigation. I'm authorized to take it into custody." Henley said, "There is no ongoing investigation. The case was closed 7 weeks ago." Vess said, "The case has been reopened. I'm taking the evidence. You can accompany me to the station if you'd like to file a formal complaint." Margaret said, "You're lying. You're not here to investigate. You're here to destroy it." Vess looked at her. His expression was cold, professional, unreadable. He said, "Miss Linden, I understand you're upset, but you're interfering with police business. Hand over the folio, or I'll have no choice but to arrest you for obstruction." Henley said, "You're not taking anything. We have a court order granting Miss Linden access to this evidence. It's legally hers." Vess said, "And I have the authority to seize evidence in a criminal investigation, which supersedes your court order." Two more men emerged from doorways behind them. They wore plain clothes, but their bearing was unmistakable. Police officers, or men trained to act like them. Margaret was surrounded. She looked at Henley. His face was set, furious, but he was calculating odds, distances, possibilities. There were 3 of them. There were 5 of Margaret's group, but only one side had legal authority. Only one side had weapons. Vess said, "Last chance, hand it over." Margaret held the folio tighter. She said no. What happened next occurred in the span of seconds, but Margaret would remember it as though time had slowed to nothing. A voice from behind Vess, "Detective Inspector Vess, step away from the woman." Vess turned, so did Margaret. Standing at the corner was a man in his 60s, wearing a magistrate's robes. Justice Harrow, the man who had signed the court order that morning. Beside him stood Martin Ashwell, the solicitor, and beside Ashwell were 2 uniformed constables. Justice Harrow walked forward. He said, "Detective Inspector, I signed the order granting Miss Linden access to that evidence. I did so because I found her petition credible and her cause urgent. Are you telling me you intend to seize evidence that is legally under her control?" Vess said, "Your Honor, this is a police matter." Harrow interrupted. "It is also a legal matter, and I am a representative of the court. You will not seize anything without a warrant." "Do you have a warrant?" Vess hesitated. "I can obtain one," Harrow said. "Then do so. Until then, Miss Linden retains possession of the folio. Constables, please ensure that Detective Inspector Vess and his associates do not interfere." The 2 constables stepped forward. Vess looked at them, then at Harrow, then at Margaret. His face was a mask of controlled fury. He said quietly, "This isn't over." Then he turned and walked away. The 2 men with him followed. Margaret stood frozen, clutching the folio. Henley let out a breath he had been holding. Justice Harrow approached Margaret and said, "Miss Linden, I took the liberty of following you. I had a feeling you might need assistance." Margaret said, "Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if." Harrow said, "You would have lost the evidence, and possibly your life. Now listen carefully. You have perhaps 12 hours before they obtain a warrant or find some other legal mechanism to take that folio from you. You need to publish what you found immediately. Do you understand?" Margaret nodded. Harrow said, "Good, then go, and do not let them stop you." Margaret, Henley, and Ashwell ran. They ran through the narrow streets of Clerkenwell, past markets and workshops, dodging carts and pedestrians, until they reached the offices of the Chronicle on Fleet Street. They burst through the door. Henley shouted for his editor. Thornton appeared, startled and annoyed, until he saw the expressions on their faces. Henley said, "We've got it, the full evidence, Sarah Linden's documentation, everything." Thornton said, "Show me." They went to Thornton's office. Margaret opened the folio. She spread the ledgers, the letters, the contracts across the desk. Thornton began reading. His eyes moved quickly across the pages, absorbing dates, names, figures. After 10 minutes, he looked up. He said, "This is the biggest corruption story in a decade, maybe longer. If we print this, we're accusing sitting officials of organized theft. They'll come after us with everything they have." Henley said, "So we make sure the evidence is airtight. We verify every claim, we cross-reference every payment, and we print it before they can stop us." Thornton said, "How long do we have?" Henley said, "Justice Harrow said 12 hours. I think we have less." Thornton nodded. He turned to Henley. "Get everyone in here, every reporter who's not on assignment. We're working through the night. I want this verified, written, typeset, and ready to print by dawn." He turned to Margaret. "Miss Linden, you're going to help us. You know this material better than anyone. We need you to walk us through it, step by step." Margaret said, "What about Detective Inspector Vess? What if he comes back?" Thornton said, "I've got men watching the door. If anyone tries to stop us, they'll have to come through me first." It was 4:30 in the afternoon on April 21st, 1912. In less than 14 hours, the Chronicle would publish the most explosive story in its history, if they could finish it in time. Through the night, the offices of the Chronicle hummed with frantic energy. Reporters crowded around tables, cross-referencing Sarah's ledgers with public records. They sent runners to the London County Council archives to pull contracts and expenditure reports. They contacted sources within the municipal government, asking pointed questions, recording sworn statements. Arthur Henley wrote the main article. He structured it carefully, methodically, building the case piece by piece. He began with Sarah's disappearance. He described the closed investigation. He introduced the ledgers. He named the names: Alderman Geoffrey Pritchard, Councillor William Thorne, Magistrate Edward Bellamy, and 11 others. He detailed the scheme, the false contracts, the shell companies, the diverted funds. He calculated the total amount stolen, more than £47,000 over 18 months. He quoted from Sarah's letters. He included testimony from William Finch, the clerk who had corroborated the evidence. He ended with a question. If Sarah Catherine Linden uncovered this scheme, and if she disappeared immediately afterward, what does that tell us about the men she exposed? By midnight, the article was written. By 2 in the morning, it was edited. By 4, it was typeset. Thornton read the final proofs. He looked at Henley and said, "This is going to destroy careers. It's going to trigger resignations, investigations, possibly prosecutions. It's also going to make us a target." Henley said, "I know." Thornton said, "And you're sure about this? Sure enough to stake your reputation, maybe your life, on it?" Henley looked at Margaret, who sat exhausted in the corner of the office, her sister's folio still clutched in her lap. He said, "I'm sure." Thornton nodded. He turned to the press operator. "Print it. 5,000 copies. I want them on the streets by dawn." The Chronicle hit the streets at 6:30 on the morning of April 22, 1912. 50 days after Sarah Catherine Linden disappeared. The headline read, "The Cadogan Square Conspiracy: How a Missing Woman Exposed Decades of Municipal Corruption." By 8 o'clock, the first edition had sold out. By 9, people were lining up at newsstands demanding copies. By 10, other newspapers were scrambling to verify the story, to catch up, to avoid being left behind. By 11, Alderman Geoffrey Pritchard's offices were surrounded by reporters. By noon, 3 members of the London County Council had resigned. By 1 in the afternoon, the Metropolitan Police issued a statement confirming that they were reopening the investigation into Sarah Catherine Linden's disappearance in light of new evidence. Margaret sat in the offices of the Chronicle, watching the chaos unfold. Reporters came and went, shouting updates, comparing notes, chasing leads. Henley sat beside her, reading telegrams from contacts across the city. He said, "It's working. The pressure is building. They can't bury this now." Margaret said, "But we still don't have Sarah." Henley said, "No. But now everyone is looking for her." On the afternoon of April 23rd, the Chronicle received a letter. It had been delivered by hand, left at the front desk by a messenger who refused to give his name. The envelope was addressed to Arthur Henley. Inside was a single sheet of paper, unsigned, written in a careful, anonymous hand. It read, "If you want to find Sarah Linden, go to the construction site at Vauxhall Bridge Road. Look near the South Pier. She has been there since the night she disappeared." Henley showed the letter to Margaret. Her face went pale. She said, "Is this real? Or is it a trap?" Henley said, "I don't know, but we can't ignore it." He contacted the police. He contacted Martin Ashwell. He contacted Justice Harrow. Within 2 hours, a contingent had been assembled: police officers, a forensic examiner, a representative from the coroner's office. At 4 in the afternoon, they went to Vauxhall Bridge Road. The construction site was for the expansion of the bridge's southern approach. Work had been ongoing since the previous autumn. The ground was churned mud and rubble, scaffolding rising against the gray sky. The police searched the area near the South Pier. They dug carefully, methodically, through layers of packed earth and stone. At 5:30, they found something: a piece of gray wool fabric. Bone buttons, a leather satchel, rotted and waterlogged, buried 18 inches beneath the surface. By 6 o'clock, they had uncovered a body. The body was in an advanced state of decomposition. It had been in the ground for 7 weeks through rain and cold and the slow chemistry of decay. But certain details remained identifiable. A gray wool coat with bone buttons. A satchel containing a handkerchief embroidered with the initials SCL. A locket on a chain, inside of which was a photograph of 2 young women, Sarah and Margaret Linden, taken 5 years before. The coroner, Dr. Edwin Marsh, examined the remains on site. He noted signs of trauma, fractures to the skull, likely caused by blunt force. Damage to the ribs, consistent with being struck repeatedly. Defensive wounds on the hands and forearms. Dr. Marsh said, "This woman was beaten to death. Then her body was buried here, likely the same night she died." Margaret stood at the edge of the excavation, looking down at what was left of her sister. She did not cry. She had no tears left. She simply stood, silent, as the enormity of it settled over her. Arthur Henley stood beside her. He said, quietly, "I'm sorry," it said. "Don't be sorry. Finish this." The police took the body to the mortuary. They took the satchel, the locket, the fragments of clothing. They cordoned off the site. They began interviews with workers, with supervisors, with anyone who might have seen something on the night of March 2nd. The investigation that had been closed 50 days earlier was now, officially, a murder inquiry. On April 25th, 3 days after Sarah's body was found, a man named Thomas Ridley walked into the offices of the Chronicle. He was 34 years old, a laborer who had been working at the Vauxhall Bridge Road site in early March. He asked to speak with Arthur Henley. Henley met him in a private office. Ridley was nervous, sweating, his hands shaking. He said, "I need to tell you something about the woman you found." Henley said, "Go on." Ridley said, "I saw her, the night she was buried, March 2nd. I was working late. Sometimes we worked through the night if the weather was good. Around 8:30, I saw a carriage pull up near the South Pier. 2 men got out. They were carrying something heavy, wrapped in canvas." Henley leaned forward. "Did you see their faces?" Ridley shook his head. "It was dark, but I saw them dig a hole. Took them maybe 20 minutes. Then they put the bundle in the ground, covered it up, and left." Henley said, "Why didn't you report this?" Ridley's voice dropped. "Because the next day, a man came to see me. He knew my name, knew where I lived. He gave me £10 and told me I hadn't seen anything. He said if I talked, I'd end up in the ground too." Henley said, "What did this man look like?" Ridley said, "Tall, well-dressed, had a scar here." He traced a line down his left cheek. Henley felt his pulse quicken. "Detective Inspector Roland Vess." Ridley nodded. "He showed me his police badge, said he was handling things, said I should forget what I saw." Henley said, "Will you testify to this, under oath?" Ridley was silent for a long time. Then he said, "If you can protect me, if you can make sure they don't come after my family, then yes, I'll testify." Henley said, "I'll do everything I can." He took Ridley directly to Martin Ashwell's office. They drafted a formal statement. Ashwell notarized it. Then they went to Justice Harrow, who issued a warrant for the arrest of Detective Inspector Roland Vess on charges of obstruction of justice and complicity in murder. By nightfall, Vess was in custody. Roland Vess did not confess. He sat in an interrogation room at Scotland Yard, arms crossed, expression flat, and refused to answer questions. His solicitor argued that Ridley's testimony was unreliable, that Vess had been conducting a legitimate investigation, that there was no evidence linking him to Sarah's death. But the pressure was mounting. The Chronicle published Ridley's statement on April 26th. Other newspapers picked up the story. Questions were being asked in Parliament. The Home Secretary announced a formal inquiry into corruption within the Metropolitan Police and the London County Council. On April 27th, William Finch, the clerk who had first provided Margaret with ledger pages, came forward with additional testimony. He stated that in February, he had been approached by Detective Inspector Vess, who had asked him about Sarah Linden. Vess had wanted to know if Sarah had been making copies of documents. Finch had said he didn't know. 2 days later, Sarah disappeared. On April 28th, Mrs. Enid Moss, the housekeeper at the Pritchard residence, requested a meeting with police. She brought her own solicitor. In a formal statement, she testified that on the evening of March 2nd, she had heard raised voices coming from Alderman Pritchard's study. She had heard Sarah's voice, frightened and angry. She had heard Pritchard shout, "You've ruined everything." 20 minutes later, Sarah had left the house. Mrs. Moss had watched her go. She had also seen from an upstairs window 2 men waiting at the corner of Cadogan Square. One of them had been Detective Inspector Vess. Mrs. Moss testified that she had not come forward earlier because she had been threatened. On March 4th, Vess had visited her privately and told her that if she spoke about that evening, she would be charged as an accessory. She had stayed silent. Until now. On April 29th, 58 days after Sarah Catherine Linden's disappearance, a warrant was issued for the arrest of Alderman Jeffrey Pritchard on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and embezzlement of public funds. Police arrived at 14 Cadogan Square at dawn. Pritchard was still in his dressing gown. He did not resist. He said nothing. He was taken to Scotland Yard in handcuffs, photographed, and placed in a holding cell. By noon, the story was on the front page of every newspaper in London. Alderman arrested in Linden murder case. Margaret stood in the offices of the Chronicle, reading the headlines, and felt something she had not felt in 2 months. Not quite relief, not quite satisfaction, but something close to closure. Arthur Henley said, "It's not over yet. They still have to prove he ordered it. They still have to connect him directly to her death." Margaret said, "They will." Mrs. Moss heard him threaten her. Vess was waiting outside. They buried her that same night. The pieces fit. Henley said, "What about the other men? The ones on Sarah's list?" Margaret said, "Some have resigned. Some are under investigation. Some are still claiming innocence." She paused. "But Sarah's evidence is public now. It can't be buried. The truth is out." Henley said, "Because of you. Because you wouldn't stop." Margaret said, "Because of Sarah. She did the work. She took the risk. I just finished what she started." The trial of Jeffrey Pritchard and Roland Vess began on June 3, 1912, at the Old Bailey. It lasted 3 weeks. The courtroom was packed every day with journalists, members of Parliament, ordinary citizens who wanted to see justice done. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented Sarah's ledgers as evidence of the embezzlement scheme. They showed that Pritchard had been at the center of it, that he had orchestrated the payments, that he had personally profited by more than £8,000. They called Margaret Linden to the stand. She testified about her sister's final weeks, about the red ledger, about the letter Sarah had left behind. She described finding the evidence, the threats she had received, the attempt by Vess to seize the folio on Theobald's Road. They called Mrs. Enid Moss, who testified about the argument she had overheard, about Vess waiting outside, about the threats that had kept her silent. They called Thomas Ridley, who described seeing 2 men bury a body at the Vauxhall Bridge Road construction site. They called William Finch, who testified about Vess's inquiries into Sarah's activities. They called Dr. Edwin Marsh, the coroner, who described the injuries Sarah had sustained. Blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with being struck with a heavy object. Multiple blows. Death would have been neither quick nor painless. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that there was no direct proof Pritchard had ordered Sarah's murder, that Vess had been conducting a legitimate investigation and his presence near Cadogan Square was coincidental. But the jury did not believe them. After 6 hours of deliberation, they returned with a verdict. Jeffrey Pritchard, guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, guilty of embezzlement, guilty of obstruction of justice. Guilty of murder. Guilty of obstruction of justice. The judge sentenced Pritchard to 20 years in prison. He sentenced Vess to death by hanging. Roland Vess was hanged on August 14, 1912 at Pentonville Prison. He maintained his innocence to the end. He did not name accomplices. He did not confess. He went to the gallows in silence. Jeffrey Pritchard died in Wormwood Scrubs Prison on November 2, 1914, 2 years into his sentence. The official cause of death was pneumonia. He was 54 years old. Of the 14 men named in Sarah Linden's ledgers, 8 resigned from public office. 4 were prosecuted on lesser charges and received prison sentences ranging from 2 to 7 years. 2 were acquitted due to insufficient evidence. The corruption scheme was dismantled. Reforms were implemented in the London County Council's financial oversight procedures. New laws were passed to prevent similar abuses. But Sarah Catherine Linden remained dead. and no amount of justice could change that. Sarah was buried on May 3, 1912, in Brompton Cemetery, in a plot beside their parents' graves. The funeral was attended by more than 200 people, friends, colleagues, journalists, strangers who had followed her story and felt compelled to pay their respects. Margaret stood at the graveside as the coffin was lowered into the ground. The priest spoke words about eternal rest and mercy and the comfort of God. Margaret barely heard them. She was thinking about her sister at 24, walking into the fog with evidence in her satchel and hope in her heart, believing she could make the world see. After the service, Arthur Henley approached her. He said, "There's something you should know. The Chronicle has established a fund in Sarah's name for journalists who uncover corruption, who take risks, who need protection. We're calling it the Sarah Catherine Linden Memorial Fund." Margaret said, "She would have liked that." Henley said, "What will you do now?" Margaret said, "I don't know. Go back to work, I suppose. Try to have a life." Henley said, "You could work for us. We need investigators, people who don't give up." Looked at him. She thought about the last 2 months, the fear, the exhaustion, the nights without sleep, the constant threat of violence. She thought about what it had cost her to find the truth. She also thought about what it had meant. To her, to Sarah, to everyone who would read the story and know that sometimes, against all odds, the truth wins. She said, "Let me think about it." One question was never fully answered. Who was Detective Sergeant James Croft? The man who had contacted Sarah in February, who had promised to help her, who had arranged to meet her on the night of March 2nd, was never identified. No one named James Croft worked for the Metropolitan Police. No one matching his description was ever found. Theories emerged. Some believed Croft was an alias used by Roland Vess to lure Sarah into a trap. Others argued that Vess was not sophisticated enough to construct such a deception, that someone else, someone higher up the chain, had orchestrated Sarah's murder. During Vess's trial, the prosecution asked him directly, "Did you pose as Detective Sergeant James Croft?" Vess had replied, "I've never heard that name." The prosecution asked, "Then who was he?" Vess had smiled, a cold, brief expression, and said, "Ask the people who wanted her dead." No further answers came. The identity of James Croft remained, and remains, a mystery. But Margaret had her own theory. She believed that Croft was not one person, but a role, a false identity that could be assumed by anyone who needed to gain a victim's trust. She believed that Sarah was not the first person to be approached by a phantom detective promising help and delivering death. She believed there were others. Other cases, closed before the bodies were found. Other investigations that had ended too quickly, too cleanly, with conclusions that served the powerful and abandoned the victims. She could not prove it, but she never stopped wondering. The case of Sarah Catherine Linden became a touchstone in British legal and journalistic history. It was cited in parliamentary debates about police corruption. It was taught in law schools as an example of how institutional failure enables crime. It was referenced in journalism courses as a model of investigative courage. Margaret Linden did, eventually, go to work for the Chronicle. She became an investigator, specializing in cases involving missing persons and suspected cover-ups. She worked for the paper for 32 years until her retirement in 1944. She never married. She lived alone, in a small flat in Bloomsbury, surrounded by books and files and the accumulated evidence of decades of investigations. She died in 1958, at the age of 73, having uncovered 17 cases of corruption, and having helped bring closure to the families of 11 missing persons. In her will, she left her entire estate, modest though it was, to the Sarah Catherine Linden Memorial Fund. She also left a request that when she died, she be buried beside her sister in Brompton Cemetery. That request was honored. If you visit the cemetery today, you will find 2 graves side by side. One reads Sarah Catherine Linden, 1887 to 1912. She sought truth and found it. The other reads Margaret Rose Linden, 1885 to 1958. She finished what her sister began. But there are questions that remain, questions that Margaret took to her grave. Questions that history has not been able to answer. Why was Inspector Thomas Grawley so quick to close the case? Was he simply incompetent, or was he acting under orders? He died in 1931, having never spoken publicly about the Linden investigation. Why did it take 50 days for someone to send an anonymous letter revealing the location of Sarah's body? Who sent it? Was it guilt, or strategy, or fear that the truth was coming out anyway? How many other cases were closed before the bodies were found? How many other Sarah Lindens disappeared into the fog, their evidence buried, their voices silenced, their families told to move on? We will never know. The machinery of forgetting is efficient. It has been running for centuries, and it does not keep records of what it erases. But sometimes, not often, but sometimes the machinery fails. A sister refuses to stop asking questions. A journalist refuses to accept the official story. A magistrate decides that justice matters more than convenience. And when that happens, when the machinery fails, the truth comes out. Not whole, not perfect, but enough. Enough to remember. Enough to honor. Enough to ensure that the disappeared are not forgotten. There is a file in the National Archives at Kew. It is catalogued under reference number MIPO 3998, Investigation into the Death of Sarah Catherine Linden, 1912. The file contains 347 pages. Police reports, witness statements, photographs of the excavation site, copies of Sarah's ledgers, letters from Margaret, transcripts of the trial. It also contains something else. On page 283, buried in a list of evidence seized from Jeffrey Pritchard's residence, is an entry that reads, 1 ledger, red cloth, gilt edges, leather tie. Contents, unknown. Destroyed by fire during processing. The red ledger. The one Sarah had carried with her into the fog. The one Mrs. Moss had seen her place in her satchel. The one that had never been found at the Vauxhall Bridge Road site. It had been in Pritchard's possession, and it had been destroyed. Which means someone took it from Sarah before she was killed. Someone who wanted to know what she knew, what she had documented, what she was planning to do. Someone who, even after her death, even after the trial, even after justice had been served, wanted to make sure that one piece of evidence would never see daylight. The file does not say who destroyed the ledger. It does not say what it contained that was worth destroying even after Sarah was dead. It only says, destroyed by fire. But fire does not erase memory, and memory does not erase truth. Sarah Catherine Linden walked into the fog on March 2, 1912, carrying evidence of crimes committed by powerful men. She was murdered for what she knew. Her case was closed before her body was found. Her death was meant to be forgotten. But it was not forgotten, because her sister refused to let it be. And now, more than a century later, we remember. We remember Sarah, who saw corruption and documented it with precision and courage. We remember Margaret, who searched when no one else would, who fought when everyone told her to stop, who finished what her sister began. We remember that the case was closed before the body was found, and we remember that the truth came out anyway. Not because institutions cared, not because the powerful decided to do the right thing, but because 2 women, one dead, one living, refused to be silenced. That is the legacy of Sarah Catherine Linden. That is what remains, the truth. Hard-won, incomplete, contested but undeniable, the truth.